shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Behave yourselves!
Hello YouTubers out there, this is Jerry Saravia the Movies. So in my last video I reviewed Totally Killer, which is a time travel, slasher, comedy, goofy type of movie, a subgenre of horror, which of course I have to give credit where credit is due. A YouTube movie reviewer who looks at horror movies mostly, Cody Leach, had mentioned this, and I think it's very much true. This has actually been a subgenre for a little bit, which I wasn't fully aware of. So, based on that movie, I want to talk about the 1980s briefly, and some of the movies that came out during that time and how everything has changed. So, the reason I bring that up is because, of course, the movie Totally Killer deals with a young girl who, through the magic of a phone booth that is a time machine, travels from 2023 to 1987. And in the movie, she's looking for the Sweet 16 killer who had murdered 3 girls back then. So he's trying to save them and save her future mother from also getting killed in the future, not to mention in the past. It's that kind of movie, and I thought it was terrific. Really, I don't know if it's a great movie, but it's very good. It was really very good. So, that brought to mind the 1980s. Would I want to go in a time machine and travel back to the 1980s? In that case, I was a teenager back then. I'd been through junior high school, elementary, junior high, and high school, graduated in 1989. Would I want to go back to that decade when I lived in Queens, New York? And the answer is probably no. The 1980s was a very rough decade. Every decade is a little rough, to be sure. But I lived through it, and, you know, my adolescence and everything else, becoming an adult by the end of that decade. There were good things that happened in the 1980s, but there were just as many that were not good for me personally. But I won't get into the more personal things other than the environment in which I was living in the 1980s. And the environment included many things that were troubling during that decade. The decade didn't really start off with a bang. First of all, John Lennon was murdered. This was in the news, of course. I mean, so we're talking about news, but also everything else that revolved around what was happening in the news in our own community and elsewhere. So, for example, Bernard Goetz was a subway vigilante, known as that, but he only shot 1 or 2 of these kids that were pestering him for $5. And he didn't kill anyone else, so he wasn't exactly a vigilante after that. But nonetheless, that was a big story. There, of course, the Central Park jogger. Crack cocaine was a big thing. AIDS. Birth of AIDS was in the 80s, or at least on a level in which it started to affect everyone. It was a major virus, and made people quite scared. There was also that Tylenol scare, which I remember. Somebody put something in Tylenol and people died, and that's when the birth of the safety caps. So you couldn't really puncture them or do anything to put any poison in them. Junior high was rough. Now, of course, it's rough every decade. So, but mine in particular was extremely rough. It was like a jungle, trying to survive. Living through those times, in particular in school, and again, I was living in Queens, New York. It was survival of the fittest, and you had to be fit to survive because it was rough. Kids were mean. They were brutal. They were very much a lot of bullying going on, a lot of fights, but nobody ever got shot. There was actually an incident at a high school I attended, which was at the beginning, where a kid was shot in the high school auditorium. This was was back in 1985, 86, I think. At well, I'm not going to give the name of the high school because they're not around anymore, so it's better not to divulge too much information here. But it involved a spat between a guy who thought his girlfriend was dating this other guy, and he shot him. I think the kid survived. I don't remember, to be honest with you. But there were no massacres. I mean, there were massacres that happened, but certainly not to the degree that they happen today. Certainly not in a school. That was very rare. Almost never happened. Computers were sort of out there, but not everyone owned one. A lot of people liked Atari. You know, the kids like Atari and Dungeons and Dragons. I tried playing once, not successfully. But there was no internet, no cell phones. So it was a very different way of communicating with people. You learned how to communicate with people. I was always a loner, but eventually I came around. You know, it was just a matter of time. But everybody, you just had the habit of talking to everybody, you know, and if you were in a bus or using public transportation and your Walkman was on a little too loud, somebody saying, "Oh, what kind of music are you playing?" Or, "That's a little loud, isn't it?" You know, that kind of thing. Whereas today, everybody's in a bubble. You can't pierce that bubble, and that's the cell phone generation. Everybody has a cell phone. I mean, I have one. So we had landline phones, which at that time were just known as phones, or a telephone. And you actually called people and you talked to them. Picking up a phone and dialing somebody's number rather than just hitting a button instantly was a thing, believe it or not. Comic book movies were extremely rare. I think you had Superman 2 and 3. I think there was a movie called Condor Man, which wasn't really a big hit at all, from what I remember. And at the close of the decade was Batman by Tim Burton. But otherwise, superhero movies were not a thing. There was a lot more variety in movies. Speaking of movies, of course. Even in Hollywood pictures, you had a lot of variety. You had, you know, Amadeus. You had Beverly Hills Cop. You had, well, of course, the Star Wars trilogy. But aside from that, in terms of endearment, broadcast news, God, I know there are just dozens of movies. I've talked about them on this channel before, about movies I saw in the 1980s, but Crimes and Misdemeanors, Hannah and Her Sisters, Arnold Schwarzenegger pictures, you know, Sylvester Stallone movies. These were big hits at that time. They make movies today, and they're not nearly as big a hit. It's a very different time now. There was Die Hard, of course, you know, with Bruce Willis. Bruce Willis had moonlighting on television, you know. Television was also a big thing. Family Ties was my favorite sitcom. Still is to this day. I have there it is. Talk about 1980s Family Ties. This has every single season in it, including a really bad TV movie they did. It's the only thing I don't like about Family Ties. Family Ties Vacation. That came out in 1985. So yeah, but the times were different. They were turbulent. Ronald Reagan was our president. Rambo was a big thing. It was just it was a strange time, and I still don't know exactly how to encapsulate what that decade was really all about. But I will say this much, particularly with Oliver Stone's Wall Street. It was about greed. And so that's not a time I want to revisit, just based on that alone. It was a very greedy decade. Wall Street. Greedy, 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 greedy. If you weren't rich, you were nothing. It's the best way to put it. Homelessness was huge. It was really getting out of control, particularly in New York City at that time. It may still be out of control today. I don't know how it is, how it fares in New York now. But the very idea of making money and making millions and getting rich, you know, at any cost, no matter what, with no scruples attached, without any sense of repercussions. You climb, you basically were climbing the corporate ladder, leave everyone to dust, lie, cheat, and steal to do it. It was encouraged. But there were people that were, especially with insider trading, that were arrested. If you were found out doing something like that, you were done. You were gone. Whereas today, it's encouraged even more so, and there are no repercussions. It's a very strange time. So I don't know what's a better decade. You have your pros and cons about everything. Now, in terms of movies, of course, there were a lot of great movies, but and there were some bad ones. It just seems I've noticed people, even my age, who look back at the 1980s. A couple of people have this soft spot for anything 80s, in particular, really bad movies that somehow they have some value, which is odd. So, slasher pictures in particular. Friday the 13th, every year or two there was another Friday the 13th movie. Police Academy, way too many of those. It's just all across the board. But would I want to revisit it? As an observer, maybe. But to actually live through it again, no way. I think it's something that you've done, and that's that. I don't have a particular fondness for any decade. But I think the 1970s were a different type of era. I don't know really how to put it. It seems to me there was more optimism in that decade, from what I remember. Seemed like a kinder, gentler time. 1980s was just greed. 1990s was all about being politically correct, no shame. And the 2000s and 2010s, I don't even know how to characterize them. So those are just my thoughts. It's what I lived through. I don't know. That's what I think. How about any of you out there? Were you a child or a teenager or both during the 1980s? What do you think of that decade? Is there a decade you would want to go back to that you didn't necessarily live through? Which there's that also. I don't know which time I would want to check out if there was a time machine. But would you want to revisit your childhood, your adolescence, from the point of view of who you are now and see where we've come? Interesting question. So lend me your thoughts. Tell me what you think. Thank you to yet even more subscribers that I've gotten in the last few days. Thanks a lot for that. I want to point out the day the clown cried video, the latest one that I did. I was going to share links to the clips that were shown, but they have been taken down. I don't know when on YouTube, so there's really no way to look at what disaster that movie might be. But anyway, let me your thoughts. If you are a subscriber, please hit that notification bell for future uploads. And if you're not, please subscribe. Like I said, this is a place of discussing anything and everything about movies, especially movie reviews. So there you have it. That's it. And this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies, signing off.